so on. And I'd been interested in the subject of UFOs for quite a long time, but I have a background in media. I have a master's degree in journalism. And so I was interested in this idea of the possibility of censorship, whether some of this activity was being, suppressed in some fashion. And I started digging into it and decided that, what I came up with was worth writing a book about. And it might help people understand the media and how it operates a little better.
So you're saying there's actually media cover-up. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I think there is. I think it doesn't originate from the media, but I think the policy of the U.S. government, certainly at least since 1953, probably before that, is to, discourage the media from covering the subject in any serious way.
So how did the whole cover-up start?
Well, I guess you could go back to World War II in a sense, because there were UFO sightings during World War II. They called them Foo Fighters at that time. And at that time there was censorship of the media because of the war. So I think a lot of those cases were suppressed in that fashion because of military reasons perhaps, or just maybe uncertainty as to what was going on. There was a brief interval after World War II when the media was relatively free. The official censorship apparatus was, sort of dissolved because the war was over. And at that time, in the late 40s and early 50s, of course, is when there was an enormous amount of press coverage of this subject. In 1952, there was a big upsurge in activity in UFOs in the U.S., and this was very alarming to the U.S. government, some portions of the U.S. government. So there was something called the Robertson Panel, which was a CIA panel that met to discuss what to do about this, and they recommended that public interest, especially interest by the press, be discouraged through a program of what they called training and debunking. So they wanted to make the whole subject look a little bit ridiculous and thereby discourage people from talking about it and the media from covering it.
Can you elaborate, please, on the Robertson Panel and who wrote the report and who were those people?
Okay, well, it was a CIA panel, and it was chaired by a physicist named Dr. H.P. Robertson. And Robertson was a very high-level scientist. He was a colleague of Oppenheimer and Einstein and very top-level people in the physics community. And during World War II, he had been a scientific intelligence officer. He was a principal liaison between U.S. and British scientific intelligence. So he was really in the loop as far as a lot of these secret developments. And they organized this panel, which I think many people agree now was sort of a stage production in a way. They brought in a bunch of people and they went through the motion of evaluating them, and they concluded that, well, we can explain most of these things away. They don't really present much of a threat to national security, so we'll just handle it as a media problem, sort of a mass public relations or propaganda type of problem. And I think they knew exactly where they were going before they started. People such as Michael Swords, who's a sociologist and writer on this subject, has done a lot of investigations into the Robertson Panel, and he's concluded that it was kind of a stage production in a way. They weren't really interested in getting at the heart of the phenomenon. They just wanted to convince people that it was just a public relations problem.
So why did they, why don't they want the media to report on this?
Well, that's really the $64 million question. I mean, the reason that they gave to the public in the Robertson Panel was that they were concerned that there would be public hysteria, perhaps, or that it would interfere with our defense systems by by making the defense organizations vulnerable to psychological warfare, for example, or that the volume of reports would clog the communication channels, things like that. But there may be other reasons that we don't know about. I think people have always suspected there are. We know now that the UFOs from the very beginning were very interested in our nuclear weapons facilities, and that was reported by Project Blue Book director in his book about UFOs early on, and a lot of the CIA memos also mentioned the fact that the UFOs seemed to be interested in military facilities and things like that. So my feeling is that it wasn't just a public relations problem or something like that. It was a much more serious problem, that the UFOs were perhaps interfering in our nuclear weapons systems in some fashion. That's my conclusion.
Okay, so how does it work? How do they do it? And yeah.
Okay, well, what I did in my book was I reviewed the relationship between the big media companies and the U.S. government from about World War I forward. And when the U.S. government has wanted to influence the American public, they look to the news media organizations to help them do that. They basically hire them to run their censorship and propaganda operations, and that's well documented. As far as specifically how that's done, there are many methods of censoring news, ranging from simply ordering military personnel not to talk, for example, or perhaps calling up a news organization and talking them out of reporting something that is sensitive for some reason. Sometimes they have people inside news organizations that are pretending to be journalists but are in fact working for the intelligence bureaucracy. So those are just a few examples, and there's really a long list.
Can you go into detail on one of the key examples, please?
Okay. Well, I could talk a little bit about the wire services. Newspapers in the United States and elsewhere in the world depend a lot on the wire services to tell them what is going on outside their general area. They don't have the resources to send reporters out all over the place, so they subscribe to wire services like Reuters and UPI and AP and the New York Times service. So the intelligence community has always, particularly during times of war, has always focused on controlling the wire services. And by doing that, they can basically shut down a lot of the reporting that goes on. There's a number of examples that suggest they were doing that. For example, if you go back to the Roswell case, when I think it was Lydia Sleppy, the reporter, was typing out her story about Roswell on one of the wire services, she got a call, I think, from the FBI telling her to not transmit, to just stop transmission. There are other examples as well. Now, to switch to a different subject, a lot of the very best UFO reports in the 50s and 40s came from airline pilots. And this was a big problem for the U.S. government because the airline pilots had a great deal of credibility with the public. They were former military pilots, a lot of them with combat experience, and the public considered them very credible eyewitnesses. And they were talking to the newspapers about what they were seeing. So what the military did was they made UFOs an intelligence matter. In other words, the pilots were required to report their UFO sightings to the U.S. intelligence apparatus. And once they did that, it became classified material, and they were forbidden under the espionage laws to talk to the press. So in fairly short order, all those stories disappeared from the media. And the pilots tried to protest against that, but ultimately, it really came down to the fact that if you want to keep working as an airline pilot, you had to learn to keep your mouth shut. So that's how they shut down that part of it. And there's various other examples as well.
Yeah, one more example.
Well, let me think here.
That's it. Do you have a more recent one?
This really involves both propaganda as well as censorship, but in the mid-1960s and again in the mid-1970s, UFOs were reported over the ICBM complexes in the United States. And we know now from U.S. Air Force officers who were in charge of launching the missiles that this actually did happen, and that in some cases the UFOs apparently interfered with the ICBMs. The ICBMs would just shut down, 8 or 10 missiles at a time when the UFOs would show up. So obviously this was a very sensitive topic, and the military personnel were told not to talk about it, so that was one way of kind of keeping it under wraps. But because it was such a public event in Montana, there was a lot of newspaper coverage locally. The story began leaking out, and it I think what they did was that they got the National Enquirer, which had started out from someone who left the CIA Psychological Warfare Division, to report the story, and thereby it sort of diffused the crisis in a way, because the Enquirer had a reputation for questionable accuracy. So by getting the Enquirer to report the story, people would just sort of blow it off as, oh, that's another silly National Enquirer story. But in fact, what they were reporting actually did happen. So there's an example of, a couple ways they tried to keep it quiet, but then didn't succeed, and then they tried to use spin control to sort of debunk the story.
What are the disinformation techniques they're using?
Well, there's quite a few, but typically if there's a sighting, they try to explain it away as something fairly prosaic, such as the planet Venus or a weather balloon or something like that. That's a very typical way the Air Force has handled the problem. But I think they inject a lot of information to confuse the public. For example, there was a report released by the CIA several years ago that claimed that most of the UFO sightings in the 50s and 60s were due to spy planes such as the SR-71 and the U-2. Well, that's really kind of a questionable assertion, because the spy planes didn't behave at all like what people were reporting at the time. So this raised a question in the minds of some investigators, and there's a scientist by the name of Mark Rodiger who actually went to the Air Force Project Blue Book personnel, or one of the former Project Blue Book officers, and asked him whether this was true, and he just laughed at it. He said, "No, there's no truth to that. We didn't. I don't think we ever received a single report that was due to a spy plane." So that's an example of how the CIA released this report, an official-looking report. The media picked it up and ran with it without actually checking to see whether there was any truth to it. So they get away with that all the time. They float these disinformation ploys, and it becomes part of the historical record.
So can you just let's say name the companies or the institutions that are involved with disinformation from intelligence communities?
Well, I think probably all the major news organizations are involved in this to some extent. The Church Committee, which was a Senate investigation back in the late 70s, investigated this and found out that the CIA had covert relationships with organizations such as Time, New York Times, Washington Post, all the major television networks, and a whole bunch of others. So by the mid to late 70s, the CIA and the news media were working together very closely. It was explained away at the time as being only a Cold War concern, but I think we know now that flying saucers or UFOs were very much part of the mix also.
What about the international press?
The wire services are international services. Whatever goes out over the New York Times news service, for example, often gets picked up around the world. So in a sense, this propaganda or disinformation that's fed into the media goes international. So it does have an indirect impact. Now, we know that the CIA often finances publications, books, movies, things of this nature. So that also sort of goes out into the international arena as well. But it seems to me that they're mostly concerned about what the American public thinks about it, not so much the rest of the world. But I could be wrong about that.
Do you have any examples of where you can see that they actually do politics with their kind of disinformation spin? I mean, it's not just about hiding facts, isn't it?
Right. No, it isn't. It isn't hiding facts entirely. I mean, that's a big part of it. Really, it's a two-stage process. Censorship is stage one, and then injecting false information, which is propaganda, is the next part of it. One of the more spectacular examples that I mention in my book is that in 1966, CBS television broadcast a program called UFOs, Friend, Foe, or Fantasy, and it was narrated by Walter Cronkite, who was a highly trusted news reporter at the time. He was once described as the most trusted man in America or something like that. Well, we now know, because of a letter that turned up in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution, that the CIA played an important role in that program. The program basically said that UFOs could all be explained away, and don't worry about it and all that, which was kind of the government's line from the 1950s onward. But this letter confirms that a member of the Robertson Panel played an important role in putting this CBS program together. So, and it's perfectly consistent with what we know about CBS, because CBS had a very close working relationship with the CIA and did a lot of favors for them on different kinds of topics, and UFOs were just one of those.
So what is the situation today concerning CIA, disinformation, propaganda, and the mass media?
Well, I suspect that things have not really changed very much. The CIA's budget is bigger, and according to one estimate, they spend about a third of it on propaganda and disinformation. And since the budget is probably around $30 billion a year, that means they're spending about $10 billion a year on propaganda of all sorts. Now, obviously not all of that would be devoted to UFOs, but probably a good deal of it does have to do with UFOs, if we could know the truth.
What is the general danger of this kind of disinformation? I mean, the media plays an important role in society, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we really believe that we're a democracy, if we want to be a democracy, we have to know what's going on. I mean, it's just very, very straightforward. So the danger is that, by having our own government deceive us about something very basic like this, it has a corrosive effect over time. It makes people distrust the government, for one thing, and makes them lose faith in the whole democratic process. That's a big danger. And there are other dangers as well. I mean, the public has to know where money is going, for example. I mean, if money is being siphoned out of the federal budget for covert activities of one kind or another, how do we know they're not criminal activities, for example? Or, that someone's just not setting up a private Swiss bank account somewhere or something like that. So it just seems to be common sense that we ought to have at least a good accounting of where our money is going and what it's being used for, and we don't have that anymore.
Do you see any way how this system could come to an end? How we could end the disinformation, the secrecy, all of this?
Well, I think some of the better avenues of approach are certainly the internet, for example. The internet is, I think, forcing the mainstream media or the corporate media to pay a little more attention to this subject, because they know from their polls and surveys that they're losing their audience to the internet. People know that they can get better information from the internet, so they're migrating in that direction. I think this sort of puts a pressure on the big corporate media companies to start reporting accurately what's going on. So that helps. I don't really expect that we can pressure the government to come out with any information. They're pretty conservative and very reluctant to change. So I think the change has to come from the bottom up. We just have to demand that both the media and the government be a little more accountable. And that's a very difficult problem and probably has to be attacked along a broad front, with different techniques.
My last question, what's your bright vision of the future of mankind?
My bright future?
Bright vision of the future.
Yeah.
Like what you want?
Yeah. Well, I think that from my experience in science, the direction of human knowledge is moving toward an understanding of the universe that says we're not the only beings in the universe, that there's probably life on many millions of planets, even possibly within our own galaxy. And when we recognize that, I think it'll enhance our wonder about the experience of life and appreciation for the grandeur of the universe of which we're a part. So I guess my hope is that this will turn out to be an uplifting experience and sort of spiritually transformative experience.